It was Milroe who said that we judge a society by the monuments it puts up. So imagine a society that puts up statues to tyrants, to someone who nearly succeeded in tearing an empire apart, who did horribly, inexplicably cruel things, even by the standards of their own time. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the reign of Domitian or the reign of Commodus? Can you imagine when the fear wore off, when the collective insanity that enabled and was complicit with this evil wore off? Can you imagine what the Romans did next? Well, I can tell you, they sawed off the head of Domitian's statue. Pliny the Elder wrote in the year 96 about how delightful it was to smash to pieces those arrogant faces, to raise our swords against them, to cut them ferociously with our axes, as if blood and pain could follow our blows. After the death of Commodus, when his terror had ceased, the Senate issued the following decree: for him who was foe of his fatherland, let his honors be taken away. Let the honors of the murderer be taken away. Let the murderer be dragged in the dust. The foe of his fatherland, the murderer, the gladiator in the charnel house, let him be mangled. On all sides are statues of the foe, they said. On all sides are statues of the murderer. On all sides are statues of the gladiator. The statues of the murderer and the gladiator, let them be cast down. The slayer of citizens, let him be dragged in the dust. The murderer of citizens, let him be dragged in the dust. Let the statues of the gladiator be overthrown. Is that destroying history? Or is it simply the obvious response of a freed people with a conscience? Of course, the past is complicated. Very few people or causes who are displayed in bronze or iron or stone are entirely good. To judge history by the standards of the present is tricky business. But the fact that something is hard and complicated does not absolve us of the responsibility for solving for it. Rome was able to tear down the monuments of its worst villains. Here in America and in the rest of the world, we have more tools at our disposal besides just belatedly angry destruction. We can still study and learn about these people in our history books and our schools, just as we do for Commodus and Hitler and others. We can move abhorrent monuments to museums. We can take them off public property, remove them from prominent places in front of courthouses and capitals, which are supposed to be the people's house. All people. If Marcus Aurelius had caused the deaths of 1 million Romans and tore the empire in half for the sole purpose of protecting slavery, would he be our hero? No, he probably would not. If he had done it as recently as some living people's grandparents, he absolutely would not. And if his likeness had been appropriated by vicious tyrants who subverted the rule of law to intimidate fellow citizens, and his likeness was put up in statues paid for in stolen tax dollars, then it would be a perversion of his legacy and not worth protecting. You can make good arguments about Marcus Aurelius. There are good arguments about the good that Churchill did. There are good arguments about Jefferson and Washington and others. And only a coward is afraid of having an argument. The same is not true for Nathan Bedford Forrest. Jefferson Davis was a fool. Robert E. Lee betrayed his prior service and his country when he raised his arms against it and sent a generation of men to their deaths in a rebellion over the worst cause for which men have ever rebelled, and for a war that he should have had no hope of winning. And Lee, by the way, would agree with the removal of his statues. I think it wiser, Lee wrote in 1869, responding to a request to help decide where to erect memorials at Gettysburg, not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the examples of those nations who have endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife, to commit to oblivion the feelings engendered. Let the statues of the foe come down. Let the murderer's legacy be mangled. Let their celebration become dust. And finally, let better statues go up in your homes and in our public spaces that reflect the kind of society we want to become. It was Seneca, writing to a friend who'd asked for some life advice, who said that we must choose people whose way of life as well as words and whose very face mirrors the character that lies behind us. He said we should be always pointing them out to ourselves as our guardians, as our model. There is a need, he said, for someone as a standard against which we can measure our own character. In a long meditation on how Marcus Aurelius, a boy of relatively ordinary bloodlines, etched his name so impressively into history, the French philosopher Ernest Renan concludes that it was his keen regard of greatness. The moral value of a man, Renan writes, is in proportion to his faculty of admiration. As emperor, we're told, Marcus Aurelius was scrupulous in getting the Senate's approval for erecting statues. Clearly, this had an effect on him as a person. Somehow, despite facing incredible temptations and pressures, he too became a great man, worthy of the countless statues made in his likeness. In 175 AD, Marcus was honored with the creation of a bronze statue depicting him atop a horse addressing his troops, perhaps following some great victory on the battlefield. It was placed in the heart of Rome on Capitoline Hill. Although these statues at the time were common, this is the only one of a pre-Christian emperor to survive to the modern era. While dozens of other statues were melted down to make coins or destroyed by revolutionaries, this statue remained on display through the century. In fact, it was Michelangelo who, at the height of his powers as an artist, designed a new base for it, which it stands on to this day. And we are better for this. Every generation needs guidance. We need to be called to honor the greatness of our past, or in the case of some other monuments, reminded of the failures and mistakes that humanity has made. We need to see in tangible form the principles that we as people hold dear, that we aspire to mirror in our own lives. In 1863, the English writer Matthew Arnold wrote about why the endurance of symbols of Marcus Aurelius are so important, and what a grand tradition it remains. Long after his death, Arnold wrote, his bust was seen in the houses of private men throughout the wide Roman Empire. It may be the vulgar part of human nature which busies itself with the semblance and doings of living sovereigns. It is the nobler part which busies itself with those of the dead. Those busts of Marcus Aurelius in the homes of Gaul, Britain, and Italy bear witness, not to an intimate's frivolous curiosity about princes and palaces, but to their reverential memory of the passage of a great man upon the earth. Honoring this legacy myself, I keep a bust of Marcus Aurelius from 1840 on my desk. It may be the most expensive piece of art that I own, but for the reminders it has given me and the calming presence it has had, it is worth every penny. I look at it and think about how this literal piece of stone survived through cholera epidemics, smallpox epidemics, polio, the Spanish flu, the flu of the 1950s. I think about the 3 or 4 generations of people who have owned this thing, and that someone will own it after I die. And when I need encouragement, as Marcus wrote of his own practice of admiring greatness, I think of the qualities of this person in front of me. We complain that the world is going to shit, that we don't have good leaders anymore, that all our values are going out of fashion, our norms are collapsing. Yeah, of course they have. We've stopped memorializing them. We've stopped providing models for them. We've stopped honoring people who embodied them. And yet what we have put up on display, what we continue to maintain, are monuments to some of the worst people. A nation and era is judged by the monuments it erects, just as a home is judged by the mementos and family artifacts hung on its wall and displayed on its shelves. It's true, too, not just for what is put up, but for what is maintained. So the urgent question for the world and for you as an individual today is, what statues are you putting up? Who are you honoring? Who is your North Star? Who is the ruler you measure yourself against? Whose presence is inspiring you to follow in their example? What is calling you to be the person you know that you can be? And what bad examples are you striking down? What progress are you making? Are you helping society make in terms of who we honor? We must always be pointing to the good, to the best in us, as Seneca said, so we can be asking ourselves how they would behave, what they would expect of us, and we must strive and struggle to live up to this good example and do as the Romans did and rid ourselves of the celebrations of the bad. Hey, thanks for watching Daily Stoic. If you want to learn more about Stoicism, you can check out some of our other videos here. Subscribe, we'd really appreciate it. Keep learning, keep studying, and remember those 4 Stoic virtues: courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom.